Hello, Marylanders. I'm your Howard County Executive, Calvin Ball, and you're plugged into the pulse of our counties, Mako's Conduit Street Podcast. Stay tuned for another timely discussion.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Dominic Butchko. It is Tuesday, March 11th, and it is after 9:30. We are in crossover week, which means that if you are a delegate or a senator and you want your bill to pass the General Assembly, you need to get your bill to the opposite chamber by next Monday. So again, there's a lot of activity. We have, we still don't know if the federal government's going to shut down. There's a lot of chaos in Washington. Budget conversations are unfolding here in Annapolis. It seems to change every day. But Dom, you're in the middle of a lot of different things too. The entire Mako policy team is. And one of those things is housing. And we've talked a lot about this, I think, particularly over the past few years. But Dom, we're going to get into that today, and we're going to talk about a bill. But I sort of want to tee you up. And as we get into this conversation, you've been dealing with this and working this issue and, working with stakeholders, for years now. And I kind of just want to get a sense of, as we get into housing, it's a controversial topic for many reasons. And there's a housing crisis nationally, but I kind of want to get a sense of what's going on the ground right now in Maryland and kind of get a sense of where are we now before we get into legislation on the table and how that could change things and change the climate in Maryland.
Yeah, so first, what better way to celebrate crossover week than Mako After Dark? I cannot think of a better way to celebrate. I think we're at 27 days left, probably when you listen to this, less than 26 days till Sine Die. So love it. But yeah, so where are we at with housing in Maryland? So first, let's kind of take a step back. Where are we at with housing nationally? So for probably a good number of years now, the better part of a decade, we have really seen kind of the supply of new affordable housing, and that's really the key, affordable housing, start to shrink and really not grow as fast as it has historically. Historically in the United States, we've seen housing kind of expand at a steady rate, really growing kind of in sync with population. Then the 2008-2009 financial crisis hits, and we just, we no longer see that kind of growth continue with population and demographics, et cetera. Fast forward, this kind of slump happens for a number of years, and that's how we kind of end up in our current housing crisis. And so a lot of states have taken action on this. Maryland last year passed the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act. And so that was a number of kind of state density bonuses that would apply to certain project under certain circumstances. Big thing, kind of nuts and bolts in the state of Maryland and really broadly nationally, but really in Maryland with our 24 counties, housing is primarily a local issue. Markets are highly local, but also land use authority is primarily focused in our counties or in our municipalities, kind of depending on the size and type of municipality. So housing for a long time and really still is a primarily county-focused issue.
And it really, you kind of gave the timeline there of the national picture. And really, I mean, it's been a roller coaster. And during the pandemic, when money was cheap, interest rates were super low, you saw a lot of people, rushing toward housing, and people were buying houses, without even looking at them, right? They were just putting in bids because it was so difficult and it was so tight. So we see these contractions and we see, different economic situations, and that really does change the market. And I think it also changes, maybe the needs on the ground. And when you have different market conditions and inventory levels change, and look, now we have the tariffs as an issue, and that certainly raises the cost of goods and supply.
On the tariffs really quick alone, I think going forward, the next year, the next 4 years, that is going to be massive in the housing conversation. I think I read today the tariff on Canadian steel was 25%. That was bumped up to 50%. If we're already struggling to build nationally, and now the raw materials to build those units are going to, grow in price, just because a tariff is on 50%, let's say, doesn't mean the cost of steel is going to go up 50%. The cost of steel is probably going to go up 60% or more because the seller of that still has to draw a profit. So that's a big part of this conversation that, we're not going to have tonight, but is definitely kind of lingering in the background.
Right. And these are obviously things that counties can't control, but counties feel the effects and they feel the pressure on the ground. And I think you need to be nimble. And I think that's why zoning is a local issue. And not that sometimes the state doesn't need to step in, but I think you have to do that very carefully. In Maryland, zoning is really street to street, right? So that's kind of a good idea of where we are. Zoning is mostly a local issue. And look, I think there's no doubt about it. If you look around, housing is expensive, utility rates are going up. It's a tough time. And we now have a bill before us, a pretty big bill. It's coming from the governor. It's a priority for them. And I kind of want to walk through the bill and what it would do. And we've been working internally with our planners, with county experts, and going through this bill. And I kind of just want to walk through it and talk about what the bill would do and maybe some of the local concerns and how we can work to get there. So why don't we start, Dom, with sort of, introduce the bill for us. Where is it coming from and what's the point?
Yeah, so House Bill 503, Senate Bill 430, the Housing for Jobs Act. This is part of the governor's legislative package, and this is his keynote housing bill for the 2025 legislative session. And so breaking it down, kind of what are they trying to do, the nuts and bolts. So the Housing for Jobs Act, the name is kind of says it all. This bill is trying to, at its essence, set a housing to jobs ratio where you have 1.5 housing unit or 1.5 jobs per housing unit, per individual unit. So whether that's a single family home, whether that's apartment, etc. If you are above 1.5 jobs, so you have more than 1.5 jobs per housing unit, you're seen as having a housing shortage. If you are below that threshold, if you're at 1.4, 1.2, etc., you're seen as having a housing surplus. And so what this bill does is it divides the state into regions, and then it takes those the regional job and housing data, and it assigns that ratio to them. And so you have the Washington region, the Baltimore region, etc. And if your region hits a certain ratio, you're going to be impacted by this legislation. And we're going to kind of pick through what some of those things are. But some of it has to do with, approvals and schools and everything else. And if your region is below that threshold, then pretty much you're fine. A total of 9 counties are impacted by the legislation. So we primarily have our big 8 urban core jurisdictions as well as Carroll County. And so, I mean, on its face, it's definitely, it makes a lot of sense. I think everyone can understand, all right, 1.5 jobs per housing unit, we have to hit this number. That being said, when we dig into the little details, this is definitely a very complex, very meaningful piece of legislation.
Right. And so, like you just said, I mean, on its face, it sounds like conceptually that makes sense, right? You have a target. I'm sure other states have done this. And oftentimes what we see, people take what other states do and they try to just maybe copy and paste, not necessarily what they're doing here, but they take the idea and they try to make it work, plug and play in Maryland. And I said earlier that zoning is really street to street. So I can already tell, Dom, that when you try to put a statewide target down, especially amongst all the regions, and that's really rigid, that is probably going to create problems because, as we know, one size does not fit all, and there are very different conditions across the state. And again, it's fluid. So if you just put a rigid number there, that seems problematic, I guess, from my mind, right from the get-go. But again, it's understandable as to why you'd want to set that kind of a target.
So, and when we talk about that target too, so what does that mean? Because there has been a lot of conversation about, we should assign for solar, for example. We should assign an acreage target per county to develop kind of solar energy. And similar conversations have been had about housing as well. Maybe we should assign a per unit. This bill is actually not that simple. This bill is not assigning a single target for these 9 jurisdictions to hit. This bill is looking every year at what is the job to housing ratio, and it's meant to kind of filter as an on-off switch. And just because you may, have production one year, or your region may have a certain amount of production one year, and you feel like you're doing the right thing, if you have, fundamental changes in the market dynamics, let's say that you have a really big windfall and you get a lot more jobs in a region, but you can't kind of build enough housing to meet that. Or, let's say that you're Baltimore City and you're primarily a job center with a lot of folks commuting in and out. So you are probably going to have more jobs than housing units. I mean, this definitely is going to create a lot of confusion potentially. But to be clear, this is not a black and white, hit the target and you're good. This is kind of a moving, sliding. Every year we're going to look at it. Some years you're going to win, some years you're going to lose, but it's going to be very dynamic.
So even when it's fluid, I mean, it's still, again, kind of problematic as the ebbs and flows work, right? So let's get into just a little bit more and into the weeds, if you will, and the details of the bill, and talk about just kind of like, we'll take some buckets. And first, I want to talk about the impact this bill would have on the environment. And I want you to tell me about objective versus subjective standards.
Yeah, so the bill talks about setting objective standards for development, not subjective, objective standards for development. And that's really important. So when you think of an objective standard, that is something that's going to be written down. It's going to be, put in your laws and your ordinances, and it's going to say you have to accomplish X. It has to be X amount of feet, X height, made of X material. You have to accomplish that. There's absolutely
and Dom, if I can stop you there, I mean, we hear this argument, right, that standards are a good thing because builders, developers, et cetera, they want those standards across the state, right? They don't want to have to deal with different standards in different jurisdictions. And so that's something we hear a lot. And so I just want to put a pin in that, as it sounds really simple. It sounds really easy. It sounds really, yeah, let's do that. But I just want to put a pin there as you kind of walk through this.
Yeah, I think that's really important to kind of highlight and underline. We do hear a lot, and it's not just for housing, but in a lot of conversations with land use, developers, whether that's housing units, whether that's other types of projects, they would prefer kind of set objective standards that are, the same throughout the county in all circumstances. Or, I mean, take it up even further, because we've heard this too, another layer up, they would like to see that set across the state. And in a perfect world, in a binary 1 and 0, yes and no, black and white world, objective standards like that makes a lot of sense to the average person. That being said, the world isn't like that. The world is messy. The world of environmental policy is messy. And where it's really important in Maryland, one specific example, let's zoom in on forest conservation. So 2023, we're going to go back in the Mako time machine. 2023, we had the first update to the Forest Conservation Act, the first comprehensive update since the 1990s. This was back when we had a Senator Sarah Elfreth and not a Congresswoman Sarah Elfreth. And this was probably the key environmental piece of legislation that year, probably in the past 5 years. That piece of legislation was huge. Big thing for forest conservation. It needs to be flexible because the forest is flexible, the environment is flexible. Nature doesn't fall into a 1 and 0 black and white binary. You can do this and you can't do that. And so forest conservation is so successful in the state of Maryland because it recognizes the geographic diversity of the state and of the communities that we call home. And part of the reason Forest Con is so successful in Maryland is because you have flexibility at the state level, that comes down, and there's flexibility and there's local programs. And counties, we have to meet certain targets for conservation, but we're kind of given the ability to figure out how we're going to do that. And if you have objective standards, if you're saying you have to have 55 trees or X number of trees on every single project, you lose that ability to be flexible and maybe give a little bit over there, take a little bit over there, and the entire thing ends up falling apart. Just kind of in the reality that we live in, like subjective standards, they're the best we can do in some scenarios, and that works out for the developers too.
So it's not that we're looking to just say we want to do some bonker stuff, and so we need to make sure it's subjective. It's really to react to things on the ground and to make sure that we can address competing priorities like trees, right? Like stormwater management is another one, I think, right? So these things, again, it's not just plug and play. And like you said, I think it benefits developers also because they need flexibility as well, right? And so I think more flexibility in our eyes is always good, but on this kind of stuff, you don't think about what you just talked about, like how would this affect forest conservation? How would this affect stormwater management? It's not plug and play.
Well, and on those two things too, Kevin, I think it's really important to underline Forest Con and stormwater management, those are two requirements set by the state. Those are two examples where counties are implementing state policies, state directives, state direction. And so when we're having this conversation about housing, I mean, just to be frank, there's a national narrative that counties are the boogeymen and all this stuff's coming out of California and everything else. But really, in the state of Maryland, counties, we are the boots on the ground implementing both state and local policy. And a lot of the stuff that we have to implement, we're just following the state's direction. And so if you want us, the state, to follow the policies that you set forth, I mean, we have to be able to operate in a way to actually achieve those objectives that you're setting for us.
I think that's very well put. And, we've had that conversation too. And, again, we're trying to do the right thing. But again, I think counties understand their communities best. They understand how to address these competing priorities. And like you said, give a little here, take a little there, and you make it work. But it needs community input, and you need to be able to be flexible so that you can address community concerns and, again, still meet the state mandates and do the right thing. So, Dom, I want to talk about New Jersey, because I read a story recently where something like, all of their local governments are being sued by builders. And that sounds bananas. I know that, that relates to this bill because maybe there's provision in this bill that would open counties up to more liability and to lawsuits, counties and municipalities. So tell me about what could possibly be connected between New Jersey and this bill, and tell me why we don't want what New Jersey has going on right now.
Yeah, so that should be on our billboards. Maryland, we don't want to be New Jersey.
Right. For a lot of reasons. Right.
For a lot of reasons. We've seen The Sopranos. We know how that ends. No, but anyway, so yeah, why, how does this all connect? What's going on in New Jersey? So there's a provision in the bill that says that if you get denied a project, instead of going through the traditional appellate process, which is laid out in the land use article, you go to your local board of appeals, all of that stuff, you can go directly to circuit court. That's what this legislation allows. This legislation allows, if you are a project and you're denied under this bill, you go straight to circuit court, which is a pretty big change from current practice in the state of Maryland. Now, what's the connection with New Jersey? And you kind of tickled this a little bit in the beginning when you said, oh, we take things going on in other states and we're trying to see if they'll work in Maryland. New Jersey implemented a similar policy where they were trying to encourage more affordable housing in the state. And they said if, the local jurisdictions, and this includes municipalities because their local structure is a little different than ours, but they said if their local jurisdictions are not, complying with certain provisions, you can go and you can sue that county or municipality. In New Jersey, right now, under that law, 159 local jurisdictions are being sued by the New Jersey Builders Association. 159 lawsuits. That's about 1 in 4 jurisdictions in the state now being sued. If we have that in the state of Maryland, I mean, it's going to be more than 1 in 4 because you're probably going to have, most of the counties being sued under this legislation, which is really big. Important context too here. It's not like the circuit court moves any faster than a local jurisdiction does. Importantly, though, these lawsuits are a lot more expensive. And so what does this mean? What's the impact? You're using the threat of litigation to a county to get your project approved faster. If a county knows that, a developer is going to pump all of these applications in, and they have the threat of litigation, they're probably going to want to push those approvals faster, regardless if they meet muster or not, because they don't want to get sued because that's going to be incredibly costly. Now, why are we worried about costs? The state is projected to shift $250 million. And Kevin, that figure is growing by the day, $250 million onto counties in this fiscal year. So to kind of wrap this all up in a bow, in a year where $250 million is set to be shifted onto the counties, the state is actively debating a policy where litigation will go up, where local resources will get further constrained, and we're already looking at service cuts. I mean, talk about bananas.
Right. Well, I mean, look, I think that, yes, and we are chipping away hopefully at the $250 million number, but that is on the table. And yes, it changes every day, but I think hopefully we're going to make some good progress and explain to the General Assembly why shifting costs onto counties who are dealing with the same issues is not a good idea. But I mean, look, back to the direct to circuit court. I mean, look, I think right now there's a process. If you are aggrieved, there is a process, and that needs to be in place. There's no doubt that there needs to be a process for someone who is aggrieved about a permit or a local project, whatever it may be. But I think this just sort of, fast tracks everything. And that threat of going straight to circuit court, tying up resources, taking up time, eating into to local funds, which again, we're doing things like funding the blueprint. We're funding $1.3 billion over and above what the state is requiring right now. So we're trying to do all these things. There is a process right now. I think you're right that it's a threat, it's a stick. But I think as long as there's a process and it works and it's fair, then that's what we need to make sure. But just to say that we'll just take you straight to circuit court and tie up your resources, I mean that seems to be a little bit much. And when you see what's happening in New Jersey, I mean, I don't want to see that happening here, and I think that's over the top. So I'm with you there, Dom, and I think that does certainly open local governments up to definitely more liability lawsuits, whether they're frivolous or not. But it's certainly something that we don't need to be dealing with right now. That's for sure. Dom, one of the more controversial things we hear about when we hear about housing and housing pressures is really, you think about schools and infrastructure a lot. And Maryland for a long time promoted this concept, smart growth, where, you want to build where you have the infrastructure that can support the new builds and new housing and whatever it may be. And one of the biggest issues, and it comes up a lot, and I mentioned the blueprint earlier, and I mentioned schools, is class sizes. And look, this is one that gets weird and it gets political. And I'm not here to talk about the effect that blueprint has on class sizes or anything else. And that's I think that again, counties are supporting the blueprint, but when it comes to the pressure to grow and just to build, we have to be realistic, right? We have to have the roads, the water infrastructure, the schools, right? So talk to me about, this issue. It's a sensitive issue, and it's one that gets a lot of attention, but it certainly comes up whenever we're talking about new housing, is the infrastructure to support it.
Yeah, so I'm going to break this down slowly because we get a little bit in the weeds, but it's really important. And I will just say, I will flag this here. If we have any elected officials listening, which God bless you if you're an elected official listening to our podcast. But if you are, this is probably one of the most important things in this legislation. So first, really quick, APFOs, adequate public facility ordinances. These are policies that counties enact to make sure that we're not growing faster than our infrastructure, so that we don't have packed classrooms, that we don't have crowded roads, that we can flush toilets, really basic livability infrastructure stuff. That's the APFO policy. And so a lot of jurisdictions right now have adequate public facilities policies tied to classroom size, among other things. And so they say that, depending on the jurisdiction, the percentages vary. I believe in Frederick County, it's at 100%. But right now, if you want to build a housing project, you're looking at what's the school capacity. If you're at 100% or maybe a little bit over that, you're not going to be able to build until that school capacity increases. That is, current policy today in most jurisdictions.
Right. And again, I think the intent behind that makes a lot of sense. And times change. I get it. I think we need to be adaptable. And I'm not saying that every APFO across the state is perfect, and they're probably not. But I think there's a way to take a look and work locally to fix that and address that. But again, I think the general concept of make sure that you can support growth makes sense. And I think that it's always made sense. And I know that it's under a microscope right now. But again, I think the general concept comes from the right place, and it does make sense.
Right. So that's our baseline. That's how APFOs function today. Let's talk about kind of what this legislation does to classroom capacity, explicitly, individually. So right now, you want to build a house in X neighborhood. That neighboring school is at, let's say, 101% or 110% capacity. You're probably going to get denied that permit for that house. This bill says, let's take kind of a more larger view, a more regional view, and say, let's not only look at that housing project with that school in that neighborhood. Let's now start evaluating the schools and the school districts in the surrounding area. And so Frederick County actually did this, a mock version of this. And so they kind of put their different school districts on a map, and they said, these schools are at X capacity. And so they actually had a jurisdiction where, or a school district where they had about one school in the middle, five individual schools surrounding it. Four of the five individual schools were above 100% surrounding it. The one in the middle was at above 100%, but one on the edge, one outlier, was below 100%. So under this legislation, if you have a neighboring school district, the school district that you're building in, let's say you're above that 100% threshold. If you have a neighboring school that is under 100%, you can no longer deny the project under APFO. So it doesn't matter what's going on in your community. Your school is still going to be packed, but you can no longer deny that project. Now, the important kind of clarification here that folks get confused about, because the obvious answer to that is, all right, well, we clearly need to redistrict which neighborhoods go to which school, and
Right.
how does that work?
Right.
In the state of Maryland, counties don't control that process.
Right.
Counties are fundamentally divorced from almost everything with school operations. Under Blueprint, we have our contribution we have to give to the school district, and that's where our relationship ends.
Right.
So you have a policy addressing a problem that doesn't happen in Maryland.
Right. And look, and I think that we've had a couple counties recently, the schools decided to redistrict, and it's a lengthy process. It's a political process, call it what it is. And like you said, counties have no authority or control over when school systems decide to do that. I think that it would be great if every county and every school system could cooperate and kind of do this hand in hand, but that's just not the reality. And, again, we have to be realistic. So I think you raise really good points there, Dom. And that simulation, I think, really drives it home. I don't think that's the intent of the bill. But again, I think it's really difficult to prescribe something without creating a situation like that somewhere, right? Where you're going to have something odd that sticks out and doesn't really work. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of different counties showing up and saying, well, we need an exemption here or there because this, and all the things make sense, but you're locked into this rigid mandate. And I think it behooves everyone to try and avoid that.
100%.
All right, so let's go ahead and take a break there. And when we come back, we're going to get into one of the provisions that I think is probably most consequential in this bill. We'll also talk about other things in the bill and more about housing generally, all that and more after the break.
At Cigna Healthcare, we're designing a better way for you to get better care. And that starts with being there to support you around the clock. When you call or text, we'll always answer with 24/7 access to mental health clinicians. And we'll call you too, with a 100% follow-up rate to make sure you have everything you need. Whatever works best for you, works best for us. We're really just here to help you get better. That's better by design. Learn more at Cigna.com/better.
All right, welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Dominic Butchko, and we are talking housing and we're talking legislation here in the 2025 session. I'll remind everyone it's after 10 p.m. on Tuesday, March 11th, in the midst of crossover week. So please forgive us if we are a little bit tired, trying not to be sloppy. But we ended before the breakdown, we talked about APFOs and sort of making sure that you have the infrastructure to support growth. And I'll just say again, I think that as we talk about the blueprint and as we talk about, like school construction, right? And if you're growing and kids are coming, which they come with new housing, you need to have school capacity. I think when you look at the budget and you look at school construction, the costs have gone up so much. And I think even now you have the state acknowledging that, what worked just a few years ago just isn't working now. So we need to put more money into school construction to build more schools, but the money isn't there. And so that's just another issue when you try to unravel these things. It's so interconnected. And I think it's really important when we think about growth and infrastructure. But Dom, I want to get into what I think, again, is probably the most consequential provision in this bill. And it is one that has been debated over the years. I think, as recently back in the 90s. And it's kind of maybe hard to find it in the bill. It doesn't stand out. There's no billboard saying, here's where we're going to talk about vesting. And vesting is the term, early vesting versus late vesting. Dom, again, I think this is one that we should spend a few minutes on because I think it's a big deal. And again, I think it's not very apparent in the bill, and maybe some people haven't gotten there yet. So let's talk about vesting, Dom, what it is, why it matters, and what this looks like in other states, the pros and the cons.
Yeah, so vesting, again, we're really getting in the weeds tonight at 10:08 on a Tuesday. I love it. So, what is vesting? Why does it matter? So, vesting can really be thought of in two buckets. You're either early vesting or you are late vesting. And so, what does that really mean? Fundamentally, whether you're early or late vesting, that is really at the point where you can more or less kind of lock down the approvals and the circumstances on the ground. And so, in an early vesting state, you put in your application, you get certain approvals at a certain point, and you are locked in to go. It doesn't really matter kind of what changes. So you're early vested, you get your approvals. Let's say you want to wait 5, 10 years. It depends on the jurisdiction, maybe even longer. But as long as you got those approvals, you can wait and build later on, regardless of what the fundamentals on the ground, what they are, what they've changed, etc. Late vesting states, which Maryland is one, and the majority of states in the U.S. are late vesting states, look at it a little bit differently. So let's say that you get your approvals. We recognize that today the environmental conditions are good. We have the school capacity today. We have the sewer capacity today, et cetera, et cetera. And so for a certain period, yes, you can go and you can build. You got your approval today. Should you choose to wait, though, for whatever reason, you may have to go back and get something signed off again or get something finalized saying that, we are going to start building today. And if conditions change, if sewer capacity changes, if road capacity changes, because we're late vesting, you may have to delay the project. Now, you're not delaying a project for nefarious reasons. You're delaying a project because the fundamental infrastructure capacity in that community has shifted from when you put in your initial application.
Right. And and that's exactly why I think this is very, very consequential. And look, I know that there's another side to this, and I'm sure that, developers would see it differently. But to me, and this is me talking, to me, under early vesting, like you said, a developer essentially locks in zoning, land use rules, and infrastructure requirements as soon as they submit an application, even if the project isn't going to break ground for years or for decades, right? So that is a big deal because it really blocks communities and community input from updating land use plans to address like shifting needs, environmental concerns, infrastructure, et cetera.
Well, Kevin, that's an important point. If we can just kind of put a pin in that really quick. So in the state of Maryland, again, we're getting wonky here tonight, folks. In the state of Maryland, counties have to update their comprehensive plans every 10 years. Every jurisdiction has to go through this process. The counties have to do it. The municipalities have to do it. If you're a developer and you know that a comprehensive plan is going to get updated and you know that a certain designation is going to change, not in your favor, this policy basically allows you to sneak in under the radar, get that section locked in, regardless of the impacts of the community later on and the changing dynamics.
Right. Absolutely. It encourages speculative development, right? Where you have developers just placing, filing placeholder applications and locking in favorable terms. And again, I can understand why that would benefit a developer, but I think when it comes to communities and shared constituents, that's a problem. So just to Dom, so with late vesting again, I think it's more of a balanced approach, right? And it ensures development aligns with infrastructure capacity, and it again allows communities to have more input and to update things as they need to. So this bill, though, what does it do, Dom, in terms of vesting? What does the bill ultimately do? What would this look like if this language were to stay in the bill and if it were to pass as is? Would it do all the things we just talked about?
Yeah, so fundamentally, it would shift Maryland from a late vesting state to an early vesting state. Now, important context for vesting in the state of Maryland, we are a quote unquote late vesting state. The vesting terms are not universal across all 24 jurisdictions currently. And so this would kind of mess with that process. So jurisdictions have some leeway. Some stuff is kind of set at the state level that informs that. This would push us to a much more early vesting state. Now, important context, this is an affordable housing package. So where does kind of vesting interact with affordable housing? And we have data on that. In the states that have early vesting versus the states that have late vesting, fundamentally, there's really no difference in the production of affordable housing. There's really no difference in the circumstances that they're facing versus the circumstances that we're facing. Washington State is a perfect example. They are an early vesting state. They're very similar to Maryland in certain ways. They have the exact same affordable housing challenges that we do.
Right.
Fundamentally, this is just a bonus to developers.
Right. And Leanne, I'm just going to, so again, I think this is very consequential, and I'm just going to wrap it with, again, I'm going to walk through this one more time. So, I mean, under early vesting, I think, you're blocking communities for updating land use plans. You're letting developers sidestep new zoning laws or infrastructure. You're encouraging speculative development, and you're also shifting financial risk to counties, which, have to provide roads, schools, and services based on outdated plans. So again, I feel like late vesting is a more balanced approach. I think there's a reason why the majority of states, like you said, are late vesting states. And there's not a lot of talk about this, but I do think it is very, very consequential. And I think this needs to get ironed out. Again, I know we're in crossover week and there's a lot going on, but this is a big bill, Dom, and I think it's worth taking the time to talk about that a little bit. So do you anything else to say on vesting, Dom, or do you want to move on to sort of the next bucket?
I think let's move on to the next bucket.
All right. So next bucket here, Dom, we've talked about a lot of stuff here, but I want to get into sort of our next bucket here. And that is, I'll just call it confusion at the local level and maybe a little bit of chaos with some of the stuff that's in this bill and how it would be implemented locally. So again, we have been working with our experts, county planners and professionals. You've spent so much time talking to counties across the state and trying to understand how this bill would impact certain counties, how it would impact all counties, and trying to find the intricacies of where the pressure points might be for individual counties and sort of the different circumstances or individual or off the wall circumstances. So Dom, tell me about why this bill would create, in some sense, in some circumstances, maybe some chaos in counties with local land use and dealing with housing issues locally.
Yeah, so let's go back to the beginning part of the conversation. It's the Housing for Jobs Act, and we have that housing to jobs ratio. Importantly, at the regional level, that can shift. And so right now, the way this has been set up, the way it's been explained to us, the housing for jobs ratio will be reanalyzed every year. And so every year, the regions that are laid out in the bill are going to be looked at for how many jobs are they bringing in, how many housing units do they have, or are they starting to develop, and what do those numbers look like? And importantly, this is not a X target county. Hit this, make your plan, line it up with your comprehensive plan, and move towards it. This is a constantly shifting up and down bar with the dynamics. Now, what does this fundamentally mean? Because the shifts can be very dramatic. You can have a scenario where it's like a light switch. And if you've ever seen those like old vampire movies where the guy's hitting the light switch up and down, that's exactly what this policy can kind of open up, where 1 year you're preempted, the next year you're not preempted. 1 year you're preempted, the next year you're not preempted. And some of the underlying fundamentals, specifically with the job market, could be influencing those figures, and they have nothing to do with housing production. Instead of having, a steady plan that we can build on and that we can work towards, I mean, you can call it confusing depending on how big the variables are and how much it moves. It could be chaotic, but you could have, an environment where you don't have predictability. You're not sure which year, what is the state law versus the local jurisdictional law, and then add vesting to it. So let's say, if you have early vesting now, are you early vested in a year when you were preempted and that has one circumstance versus are you early vested in a year and that has another circumstance? So this can create a ton of confusion, both for the developers, but then also for the counties and for the communities that these projects are going in.
Right. And Dom, before, someone says, well, it's not often that you'll have a circumstance that would cause such a change in the market or a change in the economy. Let's just look, we had the housing crisis, we had a global pandemic, right? That changed everything. And now, unfortunately, we have a lot of people losing their jobs in the federal government, which will impact population and the economy for sure. So, Dom, I mean, it's not like this is not something that happens often where you do have massive changes in economic conditions or, population shifts. I mean, it does happen. So I can understand. And like you said, if you get locked in with early vesting in a year where things are not quote unquote normal, what does that mean? And how does this work? And I can imagine, year to year shifts, or even, a shift every 2 or 3 years. You're preempted, you're not. That you're in or you're out. That seems very chaotic. I think that's the right word.
All one has to do is look towards Washington. All you have to do right now is look towards the unpredictability from Washington and Maryland, a state which is so reliant on the federal workforce. What is this going to look like? Because we know the next few years, they're going to be unpredictable, to say the least.
Right. And certainly it's going to have, again, an impact on our economy, on housing demand, on population, on all the things that are part and parcel to sort of the triggers this bill seeks to put into law. So again, I think that's a really real world examples there of why locking something in like this might not be the right idea. And our final bucket, and again, we're going on, 10:30, forcing bad projects. Again, I kind of want to get into that as well. And I think that kind of puts a bow on everything and wraps it up nicely as what this bill in our mind would ultimately do. And again, I want to make sure that everyone listening understands we are working. We have amendments and we're working amongst several stakeholders to try and put the bill in a position where, we feel like it's implementable and it won't create a lot of the problems we've talked about. But Dom, I want to wrap this up and sort of put a bow on it. But again, make sure that everyone listening understands we have put a lot of work into this. We have amendments. We're working with the administration, with stakeholders. We want to get to the right place. Counties want to create more affordable housing. Let me repeat that. It doesn't behoove counties not to have affordable and workforce housing. It's something everyone wants to do. We just need to have different levers to pull to make it work locally. So I also want to make sure people understand that. We probably should have said it at the top, Tom, but let's put a bow on this and talk about our concerns ultimately and how this just wraps up into, problems on the ground and maybe projects that don't necessarily work or aren't a good fit.
Yeah. So Kevin, I think the way you put that is absolutely perfect. And to put a finer point on an already incredibly fine point, sir, at 10:21 in the evening on a Tuesday, counties are vehemently pro affordable housing. Counties are pro jobs. Counties are pro healthy communities. Counties are pro environment. Counties are pro fiscal responsibility. Counties operate in a world where we have to be able to walk and chew gum. We have to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And the problem that we see with this legislation is that, we have competing goals. We have policies that might be mismatched for Maryland. We have policies that might be hollowing out some of our environmental protections. And what is really the benefit of that? We have policies that are meant to put pressure on jurisdictions via the threat of litigation. For what end? And so fundamentally, if this were to be implemented, you're just going to see bad projects put into the communities that we call home. Now, MAKO is working very hard, both internally with all 24 jurisdictions and our phenomenal pool of subject matter experts, as well as the administration and both committees to improve this. Because we are pro affordable housing, but we're also pro environment, we're also pro business, and we need to have a bill that also reflects everything else that we are pro. And I think we'll get there.
Right, Dom. And look, I mean, you've done a great job here. It's a lot to digest and we get it. Look, housing is not in my policy portfolio. I do budget and fiscal issues and elections and other things. And this is just, for me, really in the weeds. But I mean, I think even at the 30,000 foot level, we have a lot of responsibilities, many of which are state mandated. And, trying to make all the things work locally in different economic conditions, different parts of the state, different job needs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's difficult to operate under one size fits all mandates. That's not going to be a surprise to anyone who listens. But look, that's just the bottom line. And I don't think that's the intent. Any of these things that we see as problematic, it's not the intent of anyone. It's not the intent of the administration. And we don't see it that way. I know everyone's trying to work toward the same goal. And again, I want to emphasize that counties aren't saying no. We have a lot of changes we'd like to see, but again, we need to make it flexible enough so that we can actually implement these things and that these things work locally, because ultimately we want tools that work. And that's the goal, right? And so we need to make sure we're passing laws that we can implement locally and that deliver the solutions that everyone wants to deliver, right, Dom? So,
Kevin, if I can just build on that really quick too. Counties are partners with the state. We are partners in government. We saw that this year with the work that Mako did on renewable energy and solar. We saw it on a number of bills, both with Senate and delegate sponsors, but also administration bills where we have partnered with the state to find solutions. We are partners with the state, just like with siblings or with family. Sometimes we bicker, sometimes we have to, find our way. But fundamentally, we remain committed partners with the state in serving our mutual constituents.
I think that's a great way to put it. And again, we're all working toward the same goal, and we just need to have flexible tools so that we can get there and deliver the results. So, Dom, I think it's great to leave it there. Any closing thoughts before we sign off?
27, dare I say 26 more days. I cannot wait.
Yes, we are barreling toward the finish line. But again, on a more serious note, a lot of uncertainty in DC, a lot of people losing their jobs. We just had a big revenue write down. There are still very consequential discussions happening on the budget, and maybe even the need to come back for a special session just because there is so much uncertainty and it's very difficult to predict what the future holds, especially when the state is staring at billions of dollars worth of deficits. And again, it's just a challenging environment. So we're going to keep working to make sure that everything is implementable and that counties can provide for our residents and that we can do the thing the state wants us to do. And of course, fund the blueprint is part and parcel number one. So we'll keep you updated there, but you should always be following along on the Conduit Street blog. Every single day, every piece of testimony Mako submits, it gets a blog article, and we are constantly updating the blog with policy updates as we get through the session. Also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then of course, again, be reading the Conduit Street blog. But for Dominic Butchko, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and for our esteemed producer, Chantel Malcolm-Lem, she's excellent. We will talk to you soon, and stay with us. We'll get through crossover. We'll be back next week. Thanks.